Sega made the best 3D games for the Sega Saturn. When Sega found out about the Sony PlayStation, they doubled the number of CPUs in the Sega Saturn. It was a brute force, inelegant solution, and only a few game developers were able to get top 3D performance out of the Sega Saturn besides Sega's armies of programmers. I'm going to go over the best 3D Saturn games made by Sega. But before that, make sure you are subscribed and ring the bell for more authentic Sega flavor. Virtua Fighter 2. The original Virtua Fighter changed video games forever by featuring smooth 3D animated characters fighting with a never-before-seen level of fluidity and speed, but with flat-shaded polygon characters. Sega followed it up with the quintessential Sega 3D fighting game Virtua Fighter 2 with full texture mapping, but with the same awesome frame rates and fluid animation. The fighting in Virtua Fighter changed the previous dynamic by, instead of having to memorize special moves, it had a new focus on speed and combos as a fighting strategy. It really was a new level of Twitch combat, and I'm not talking about the streaming service. I'm talking about instant 60 frames per second reactions. If you have a Sega Saturn, Virtua Fighter 2 is essential. Nights into Dreams and Christmas Nights. Sega in the 90s must have been a weird place at a weird time. Instead of playing it safe and making yet more Sonic the Hedgehog games for the Sega Saturn, Sonic Team decided to go out there and made two completely new games with new IPs, Burning Rangers and Nights into Dreams. Nights into Dreams is a little hard to describe. It is a 2.5D platformer, but instead of running and jumping, you play a flying dream person named Nights, and it really creates a sensation of flight and movement. The goal is to make it through stages collecting power-ups and trinkets in time against the clock and avoiding enemy dream inhabitants that are trying to slow you down before fighting that stage's cartoon boss. It is colorful, fun, and has a combination of excellent 3D graphics and 2D sprites. It has really great music. Sega also released the 3D gamepad, which featured an excellent analog stick and a form factor which would later go on to influence the Sega Dreamcast controller. The 3D controller had support in later games, and one of these days I need to do a video on all the games that support it. Sonic Team also made a special demo version of Nights called Christmas Nights, and it had the first level of the game. But if your clock on your Sega Saturn got close to Christmas time, it would play a special Christmas episode called Christmas Nights with Christmas-themed graphics, music, and a Christmas story. It's adorable. Nights into Dreams is so much more than a kid's game, and it's appropriate for all ages, but it's also fun for all. It is a timeless classic that unfortunately did not get meaningful sequels until a very regrettable Wii game that was made years later. There were ports of this game to the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC, but the Saturn version is so quintessential, it is an absolute must-play. Burning Rangers. Sonic Team followed up Nights into Dreams with Burning Rangers. It's a third-person 3D action game starring an anime hero team that has magical suits that fights fires in a very flammable future. Set in a future where spaceship megacities just instantly explode into fire, our heroes need to shoot the flames with anti-fire guns that turn the flames into energy crystals, and then they use the crystals to help transport people to safety. It is a little bit of a wacky premise, but it's very 90s, very anime, and very Sega. It features pretty decent fluid 3D animation, 3D environments, and a bright, well-designed anime aesthetic. It is one of the only Sega Saturn games that has pretty decent 3D environments. I was always curious about Burning Rangers, and it is the one game on this list that I have played the least, so I look forward to playing through it. I love discovering old retro games that I missed out on, and sharing games like this is what this channel is all about. Panzer Dragoon. Panzer Dragoon was one of the earliest Saturn games that hit the market after the launch of the Saturn. It was a Mobius-inspired, heavy metal-like fantasy desert punk on-rail shooter. This was really impressive back in the day, and it actually was very impressive at the time, and I remember being fascinated by the fluid 3D flying and locking onto bad guys with your dragon and then blasting them with the dragon breath. It's a Sega action game through and through. It had an excellent direct sequel, and an RPG sequel which is known for being crazy expensive, and a follow-up on the original Xbox, and years later, a modern remake. Panzer Dragoon is one of many awesome creative Sega properties that the company needs to actually do something significant with. But checking it out on a Sega Saturn is an excellent place to start. Sonic R. It's a crying shame that we didn't actually get a major 2D or 3D Sonic game on the Saturn. But if we did, this is what it could have looked like. So instead, Sega delivered a 3D racing game with Sonic, which turned out to be a mixed bag. The default controls are actually pretty hard to get used to, and Sonic and his friends sort of handle like dump trucks. It comes across as a little unresponsive and hard to control at first. It takes a while to get the hang of things, and it comes as a little surprising because Sonic is known for fluid motion. It plays better with the 3D controller that came with Knights, or via the GameCube controller on Sonic Gems collection for Nintendo GameCube. I know it sounds like I'm being a little tough on this game, but I actually really like it, and it has one of the best soundtracks I've ever heard on any game. I consider this to be a spiritual start of the Sega All-Star Racing Game franchise, and it is a quintessential Sega in the 90s being Sega thing. Virtua Fighter Kids. Virtua Fighter Kids is often overlooked, but it is surprisingly fun. It is a just barely simplified version of Virtua Fighter, but with crisp visuals and a great frame rate. Here's the thing. Virtua Fighter already has a very accessible learning curve and simple controls, so this is an attempt to make a version to appeal to kids and make it more kawaii cute. In anime, you occasionally see SD or super deformed versions of an anime with giant heads and cute comedic appeal. That is exactly what they did here. One of the entire point of playing retro games is to enjoy a time capsule of the cultural zeitgeist of the time. And this really captured what was going on in Japan anime and game culture in the late 90s. I can't sort of believe I said zeitgeist in a sentence while talking about Virtua Fighter Kids. It's actually a really great party game, and it's a lot of fun. Virtua on Cyber Troopers. In the arcades, Sega had Virtua on Cyber Troopers as a twin-stick arcade shooter which was obviously influenced by Mobile Suit Gundam. You played one giant 3D mech of various different designs facing off against another 3D giant mech by running around, hitting them with swords, and shooting them with cannons while dodging their attacks. They had a special controller twin stick which brought the whole twin stick tank controls home from the arcades, and this was a cult hit for network arcade combat in Japan. However, they put together a really great Saturn version and came up with a control scheme that works for the standard Saturn controller. There's also a really great Dreamcast follow-up. Fighter's Megamix. Virtua Fighter was a runaway hit, and it also spawned Fighting Vipers and Last Bronx, which I absolutely need to cover in future videos. Fighter's Megamix was Sega doing Smash Bros, but also Virtua Fighter. It was a crossover game that combined fighters from 3 Sega fighting games series. and they even had the Hornet car from Daytona, USA, and Sonic as a secret fighting character. It is an excellent party variety pack of Sega 3D fighting characters and a tasty party platter of 3D martial arts violence. Daytona USA Circuit Edition. Daytona USA Circuit Edition is an update to the Sega Saturn version of Daytona USA, a home port of an arcade racing game which is just barely based on NASCAR racing, but not really. It makes me wonder why they even bothered to get the NASCAR license, because the game has always included racing out in the countryside, which is not what NASCAR is about. This is an upgraded version of the original that I wanted to play because it had support for the 3D controller. The Daytona USA arcade game was a phenomena, and the Saturn version brings home a lot of that. And the later Dreamcast version is also not to be missed. Sega Rally. During the 80s and 90s, Sega was a king of the arcade. Sega Rally is an arcade-style racing game, and of course, being from Sega, it's actually based on a real arcade racing game, about racing rally cars at a buttery smooth 60 frames per second. Being an arcade game, you're racing against a timer, and it also features really cool, fun 3D jumps. It looks and feels exactly what an early 3D mid-90s racing game should look like, because it is one. The Sega Saturn was developed with dreams of 2D graphics in mind. The SuperH Hitachi CPU architecture was the result of 2D programmers and artists dreaming of more powerful hardware to handle more advanced artistic visions that weren't possible on 16-bit hardware. Then, Sega doubled the number of CPUs as a result of Sony entering the video game market with their own system with advanced 3D capabilities. The $299 Sony PlayStation was $100 cheaper at launch than the Sega Saturn, which was initially $399. And the Sony PlayStation had dedicated 3D processors designed to help render polygons, and was designed for 3D gameplay from the start. The Sega Saturn could do 3D graphics, but was running 3D software rendering engines running on non-specific Twin RISC CPUs. Game developers could get better 3D results with less effort on the Sony PlayStation, but that didn't stop Sega from using their armies of programmers to turn out some amazing games for the Sega Saturn. This was also decades before multiprocessor design became common, and many game developers were only used to working with one CPU at the time. Sega sold almost 6 million Saturn systems in Japan, and almost 2 million in the US, and 1 million systems in Europe. Sega sold roughly 9.26 million Sega Saturn systems worldwide, compared to the Sony PlayStation, which sold 1.2 million consoles. The Sega Saturn was outsold over 10-1, but that did not stop there from being a ton of great games developed for it, many of which are completely underappreciated and unknown, and I can't wait to tell you more about them. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel and share these videos with your friends and enemies who are into retro video games. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome. Play retro.